Morning Śrimad-Bhagavatam class at ISKCON Dublin on Tuesday the 7th of September 2021. As always, we'll start with the chanting of jñānaṁ. Hare Krishna. Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Jaya Gopi Janavallabha Girivaradhari Jaya Gopi Janavallabha Girivaradhari Yashodanandana Braja Janaranjana Yashodanandana Braja Janaranjana Jamunatira Vanachari Yamunatira Vanachari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Jaya Gopi Janavallabha Girivaradhari Jaya Gopi Janavallabha Girivaradhari Yashodanandana Braja Janaranjana Yashodanandana Braja Janaranjana Jamunatira Avanachari Yamunatira Avanachari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Jaya Gopi Janavallabha Girivaradhari Yashodanandana Braja Janaranjana Jamunatira Vanachari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. A reading from Srimad-Bhagavatam, Canto 1, Chapter 15. The Pandavas retire timely. Text 31. Vishoko Brahma Sampatya Sanchina-dvaita Samshaya Lina Prakriti Nirgunyad Alingatpada Sambhava Vishoko Brahma Sampatya Sanchina-dvaita Samshaya Lina Prakriti Nirgunyad Alingatpada Sambhava Vijoko Brahma Sampatya Sanchina-dvaita Samshaya Lina Prakrati Nirgunyad Alingatpada Sambhava Vishoko Brahma Sampatya Sanchina-dvaita Samshaya Lina Prakriti Nirgunyad Alingatpada Sambhava Vishoka, free from bereavement. Brahma Sampatya, by possession of his spiritual assets. Sanchina, being completely cut off. Dvaita Samshaya, from the doubts of relativity. Lina, merged in prakriti, material nature, nirgunyat, due to being in transcendence, alingatvat, because of being devoid of a material body, asambhava, free from birth and death. Translation. Because of his possessing spiritual assets, the doubts of duality were completely cut off. Thus he was freed from the three modes of material nature and placed in transcendence. There was no longer any chance of his becoming entangled in birth and death, for he was freed from material form. Purport by His Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami, Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. Doubts of duality begin from the misconception of the material body, which is accepted as the self by less intelligent persons. The most foolish part of our ignorance is our identifying this material body with the self. Everything in relation with the body is ignorantly accepted as our own. Doubts due to misconceptions of myself and mine, in other words, my body, my relatives, my property, my wife, my children, my wealth, my country, my community, and hundreds and thousands of similar illusory contemplations cause bewilderment for the conditioned soul. By assimilating the instructions of the Bhagavad Gita, one is sure to be released from such bewilderment, because real knowledge is knowledge that the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Vasudeva, Lord Krishna, is everything, including oneself. Everything is a manifestation of his potency as part and parcel. The potency and the potent are non-different, so the conception of duality is at once mitigated by attainment of perfect knowledge. As soon as Arjuna took up the instructions of Bhagavad Gita, expert as he was, he could at once eradicate the material conception of Lord Krishna, his eternal friend. He could realize that the Lord was still present before him by his instruction, by his form, by his pastimes, by his qualities, and everything else related to him. He could realize that Lord Krishna, his friend, was still present before him by his transcendental presence in different non-dual energies, and there was no question of attainment of the association of the Lord by another change of body under the influence of time and space. By attainment of absolute knowledge, one can be in association with the Lord constantly, even in this present life, simply by hearing, chanting, thinking of, and worshipping the Supreme Lord. One can see him, one can feel his presence, even in this present life, simply by understanding the adhyagamat Lord, or the Absolute Lord, through the process of devotional service, which begins with hearing about him. Lord Chaitanya says that simply by chanting the holy name of the Lord, one can at once wash off the dust on the mirror of pure consciousness. And as soon as the dust is removed, one is at once freed from all material conditions. To become free from material conditions means to liberate the soul. As soon as one is therefore situated in absolute knowledge, their material conception of life is removed, or they emerges from a false conception of life. Thus the function of the pure soul is revived in spiritual realization. This practical realization of the living entity is being made possible due to their becoming free from the reaction of the three modes of material nature, namely goodness, passion, and ignorance. By the grace of the Lord, a pure devotee is at once raised to the place of the Absolute, and there is no chance of the devotees becoming materially entangled again in conditional life. One is not able to feel the presence of the Lord in all... One is not able to feel the presence of the Lord in all circumstances until one is endowed with the required transcendental vision made possible by devotional service prescribed in the revealed scriptures. Arjuna had attained this stage long before on the battlefield of Kurukshetra, and when he apparently felt the absence of the Lord, he at once took shelter of the instructions of Bhagavad Gita, and thus again he was placed in his original position. This is the position of the shoka, or the stage of being freed from all grief and anxieties. Translation again. Because of his possessing spiritual assets, the doubts of duality were completely cut off. Thus he was freed from the three modes of material nature and placed in transcendence. There was no longer any chance of his becoming entangled in birth and death, for he was freed from material form. Om Ajana Timandasya Gananjana Shalakaya Chakshu Amritam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobishtam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Swayarupa Gadamayam Dadati Swagadantika Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shri Vasari Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. A packed purport in today's verse, but starting with the translation itself, it says, because of his, Arjuna, possessing spiritual assets, the doubts of duality were completely cut off. So it's interesting because we're talking here, or the translation is explaining that because of Arjuna possessing spiritual assets, and the spiritual assets, or at least, we're always talking about assets in the material world, and we're all trying to accumulate assets, in some way, feeling that with such assets we become more secure in the world that we're living in. But ultimately, that's a duality, because it's not true, because we're eternal spirit souls, body is temporary, so therefore any assets that pertain to the temporary material body or your temporary material situation, they're not going to protect us from anything, because we have to leave them all behind as soon as we leave the body. So here it's emphasizing spiritual assets, and how because of Arjuna possessing those, that the doubts of duality were completely cut off. And then in the purport, Prabhupada starts with that, about doubts of duality begin, and he talks about they begin from the misconception of the material body. And this is just such a basic fundamental part of Krishna consciousness, and for most devotees, if not all devotees, it's really the first thing that we learn when we come in contact with Krishna consciousness, that we're not the body, we're eternal spirit soul. I remember for myself, one of the first books, if not the first book that I read, was The Science of Self-Realization. And I was just totally blown away. I mean, in one sense, it's such simple language, but that didn't, prevent me from being totally blown away and having an incredible realization reading that book. 2 sentences. Maybe it was even 1 sentence with a comma, but it certainly wasn't very much, a few words. It said, so we must understand we are not this body and all the problems that come with a temporary material body. And even more so, we must understand that we're not the mind and all the bigger problems that come with thinking that somehow or another the mind is who we really are. And people really get into that in the material world, somehow or other, thinking the mind and the processes and the brain and all of that, and the processes of thinking and understanding, that's the essential part of us. But here Prabhupada was just saying, no, we're not the mind, we're eternal spirit soul. And I remember having a profound effect on me. It was like a penny dropping, and you hear the penny drop, and it's like, wow. Suffering so much at that time, if not now, but suffering so much at that time on the mental platform. I won't get into details, but incredible liberation reading that sentence, that we're not the body, we're not the mind. So that's the first misconception, because of duality. But duality is a very broad subject, which I'll touch on a little bit more. But when I was reading this purport just now, somehow the example, because for me it's such a powerful example of Isaac Newton, who lived in the 1500s or the 1600s, always at these centuries, 15th, 16th century, what I think it was, anyway, whatever it was a good few hundred years ago. And of course he was revered as a great scientist. Apparently discovered gravity. That's a funny way they put it. Discovered gravity. Gravity was always there, But anyway, yeah. So a revered kind of scientist. But he was also a theist. He was a committed and convinced Christian. But most of his contemporaries during that time were not theists. The vast majority were atheists. That was kind of the trendy thing to be. In many ways it still is the trendy thing to be. Somehow or other we think we're more intelligent if we think we know the answers, and we're not acknowledging a superior being or superior power. And somehow or other that helps our egos, I guess, or whatever. So anyway, one day Isaac Newton decided to design a model of the universe, and then when he designed it, he decided to build it. And in the middle of it was a big brass ball which represented the sun, and then all the planets were around it, and it was a mechanism, a cranked up mechanism. You wind the wheel and let it go, and everything starts moving. And that ball, brass ball, stayed in the center, because that's the understanding, material understanding, that the sun is in the center of the universe like that. And all the planets at their different stages and heights were all, revolving around the sun. And then he invited some of his friends over for like a dinner kind of thing or whatever, and then showed them this model after dinner that he had created. And of course the first question that he was asked by one of his friends, scientific friends, was, "Oh, who made this, Isaac? This is fantastic, who made this?" And Isaac said, "Nobody made it." And his kind of friend looked at him and kind of askance and said, "Okay, fun over, Isaac. Just tell me who made it, or just tell us who made it like that." And he said, "No, nobody made it. I just came down one morning from bed, and there it was." And then they started to get a little. One of them at least started to get a little annoyed and said, "Okay, fun over. Who made it?" And then Isaac Newton said, "Isn't it amazing?" And for me, this is an amazing point. It's just an amazing point. It's a very simple point, but it's just so profound. He said, "Hang on a second, Isaac," or Isaac Newton said, sorry, "Hang on a second, why do you find that? Why does that upset you when I tell you nobody made it, it just appeared? This is but a tiny little model of the original that we see looking up in the sky at night. This is a tiny little replication of that. When I tell you nobody made it, you just simply cannot accept it. Absolutely cannot accept it. And rightly so. I agree with you. But how illogical that is, that you try to then tell me that this model I've created, that's based on the original that we see when we look up in the sky, that yet you want to convince me that the actual original had no designer, had no creator. It just suddenly appeared. And for me, that's just an astonishing point, Anything that we have in this material world, whether it's the cars people drive, the houses people live in, whatever it is, the teddy bear you buy your children or your grandchildren, whatever, they all have a designer and then a creator. Everything known to us has those two things. Someone who's designed it and then someone who created it. Yet, the most amazing thing, the actual world and the universe that we live in, so many people are thinking, "Oh, it just came from nothing." It's another duality. Actually, most regimes, if that's the right word, of kind of, Indian philosophy, they're supporting the idea that in some way, all living beings, they're one with the Supreme. Some people, they'd also say that spiritual philosophy, in general, both East and West, is based on the premise of oneness. and that is interesting actually, you know, if you consider that, you know, the two main spiritual traditions, if you like, in India, for instance, are those who accept that God is a person, the personal tradition, and then God who's impersonal, the impersonal tradition. And but that's the same actually in the West, you know. Basically it's theists and atheists. You can get into it in kind of more detail, but that's kind of the way it is. And the argument is that since everything originates from God or from the Supreme Person, and since God is absolute, then everything's originating from God. God is absolute. And all of his emanations, you know, everything that emanates from the Supreme Person, that even if they exist, they're existing as a result of temporary forgetfulness, for want of a better way of putting it. And that this forgetfulness is, of course, the first philosophical challenge, that's the right word, first philosophical challenge, you know, regarding the Advaita Vedanta, or this understanding, that impersonalistic understanding that we're all one. So, if Brahman, or that spiritual oneness, or the Brahmajyoti as we call it, if that is the ultimate reality, and one would add a second, it's just exclusively this impersonalistic presentation of oneness, if that is without a second, then how does one account for illusion, or maya, ignorance, avidya? They clearly point to the duality of Brahman. It's not all one, because even the impersonalists accept this forgetfulness and this kingdom that we're living in, Maya's kingdom, they accept. So that immediately, you know, calls into question the idea that everything is just one. And to be honest, the impersonalists are effectively bereft of an answer to that question. The ultimate spiritual vision, according to this Advaita Vedanta, apparently dismantles all hurdles and permits one to see the apparent truth of our essential oneness with the Supreme Person. But if we break that down, then you know, how far can we take that? How far can we take that apparent truth? Is that the ultimate reality, or merely an aspect of that reality, obscured by a superior realizations of a transcendental form of dualism, And this latter view is it's the conclusion of devotees, of Vaishnavas, and the devotees of God, who present that the dualities of the material world are in reality excelled by the oneness that's propounded by that impersonal philosophy. So in one sense, the views are aligned in that regard. However, devotees or Vaishnavas, they go further, and they present that in a way that it becomes a full circle. That spiritually, one must become aware of transcendental dualism. You know. Yeah, that's what we've ultimately become aware of, that there is a dualism, but it's a transcendental dualism like that, wherein the practitioner, their increased sense of oneness is surpassed by a direct relationship with the Supreme Personality of Godhead, pointing out that any relationship requires two participants, not one. So that's the kind of key thing. You know, we have our understanding of Krishna in his three forms of impersonal Brahman, the Brahmajyoti, the Paramatma, Krishna residing in the hearts of all living entities, and then Krishna as the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Bhagavan. And the idea is, as we've talked before, is to develop a loving personal relationship with the Supreme Personality of Godhead. But the definition of relationship is there has to be two people involved. You can't have a relationship with yourself as such, or at least a meaningful relationship with yourself. Prabhupada used to quote all the time that Religion without philosophy is sentiment, and you can see that in the world. People become fanatical about their religion and do all sorts of crazy things on the basis of religion. It's actually what gets religion a bad name. So religion without philosophy is sentimental, and as expressed, it can lead to big problems. And philosophy without religion is speculation, and that's where all these different theories of dualism, etc., impersonalism come from. So the crucial thing is the dynamic of a relationship. And logic and religion and philosophy, they basically have no value without relationships. One of the things that's most valuable to us here in the material world, one of the things most valuable is such things as love and compassion and friendship. But those qualities, those dynamics, they make no sense if there's no relationship. Without a relationship, those things make no sense whatsoever. So without a relationship, or if you present that everything is just one, and again, this idea that you can have some kind of meaningful relationship with yourself. So if we're all one, who's relating to who? If we're all one. And human nature really encourages us to understand the relation of substance and qualities, cause and effect, subject and origin, etc. So we naturally want to know, it's only natural that we want to know God's relationship both to this world and God's relationship with us, God's relationship with other individuals, etc. So the Vaishnava Vedanta provides convincing answers to those questions, whereas the Advaita Vedanta, it's basically on that subject of relationships and having two people to be in a relationship. Basically, in personalistic philosophy, Advaita Vedanta, it's completely a vacuum. It's just a vacuum. It can't satisfy, it can't answer those questions. And that's because the relationship requires two entities to interact. Whereas Advaita Vedanta, it requires nothing else. It requires no other entity, no other being, sentient being. It doesn't require that any other entity with whom we might enter a relationship with, which is just kind of a farcical presentation, actually, in many ways. So the essence of being, that is to interact. Two entities, they must be different, and even from the Advaita Vedanta perspective, they must be one. Two entities must be one. It's just it's just, as I say, quite a hard thing to understand. And then on the flip side of the coin, the idea of complete otherness, it also prevents a relationship. So we ignore the essential oneness that exists between each of us and with God. We're basically fated, if you like, or our destiny is extreme isolation. While differences are important, they should not be overly stressed. So it's kind of understanding the sweet spot, to use that phrase, between those kind of two dynamics. So according to Śrimad-Bhagavatam, according to the understanding of that we're all individuals, that we're not all one, and that we're all equals on the spiritual platform, and our quality, the quality of us as eternal spiritual beings is exactly identical with the qualities of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. There's a difference in quantity, if you like, but in quality we're actually the same. So there exists this kind of hereditary connection between all living beings as children of God, as children of the Supreme. There's also a foundational connection between all living beings and the entire perceivable and perceptible world that's all around us. And that's also a manifestation of the Supreme Personality of God. Krishna can manifest in so many different ways. In the Bible, there's that reference to God appearing to Moses as a burning bush, like that. So Krishna is unlimited. Krishna, or the Supreme Person, can do literally anything. So the notion of difference, while divulging truths, if you like, truths that are missing in personalistic philosophy, should not be extended too far, for that too has shortcomings. So again, going back to the quality and the quality and the quantity, it's kind of like, you know, in the material world we have in relationships, as an example, take a marriage relationship, you know, and sometimes it can run into difficulties, and then they have this concept of marriage counselling, which is fine. The idea is to help people overcome whatever challenges and problems they face, like that. But the point about not extending that too far, those analogies too far, in our relationship with Krishna, is that, you know, if we have a problem with our relationship with Krishna, it's not that we can go to sort of some kind of counselor to, you know, negotiate, you know, who's right and who's wrong, because from a quantitative point of view, Krishna, or the Supreme, is always right, you know, and that of course is where the principle of humility comes in, us understanding our constitutional position in relation to the position of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So those differences, if you like, shouldn't be taken too far, to too much an extreme, if you like. So spiritual philosophy, it reaches its kind of zenith, if you like, or its pinnacle in the Achinta-Bheda Tattva philosophy that Lord Chaitanya gave us. And that's considered to be the zenith, or the peak, if you like, of Vaishnava tradition. For here, with the principle of Achinta-Bheda Tattva, simultaneously one and different, so it's simultaneously, it's one, but it's also different, because it's the peak of Vaishnava philosophy, because we see both monism and dualism fully realized as harmonizing aspects of the same truth, the same reality. And that phrase, Achinta-Bheda Tattva, literally means the inconceivable oneness and difference between God and the living entity, or the living beings. And it includes both the essential truths of impersonalism, or Advaita Vedanta. It includes those, but as well, or it also includes the sense of difference presented in presented within the Vaishnava tradition. So we see with that the concept, or the understanding of the unity of opposites in its most kind of mature form. And Lord Chaitanya, he's presenting that, you know, that profound religious understanding as an ongoing exchange, or an ongoing discourse, if you like, between one and zero, form and formlessness, you know, feasting and fasting, yes and no, seeing harmony in the obvious differences of completely opposed kind of dynamics or wonders, or however you like to explain them. And the harmony, though, you know, it requires an exchange, if you like, of the different components all working in unison, like that. All working in unison together. And it's interesting that Prabhupada talks about that quite a lot, you know, that someone may have a seemingly minor part in something. You know, take a factory, say, making motor cars or something like that, and one person has this role of just putting the same thing in the same place, you know, all the time. But without that one thing being put in the same place the whole time, without that happening, it then affects the whole production of, in this case, say a car, and the car won't work, etc., won't work properly. So this idea of this cooperation between all the various parts and all the various manifestations. Yeah. So in India, you know, this has been evaluated as a or the contradiction of the one and the many. That's a contradiction that actually has been, settled by monists in one way, and by devotees or Vaishnavas in quite another way. Yeah, it's a very interesting subject actually. The brain is sort of computing many different, thinking of many different aspects to this one out of the many kind of understanding. In the West, we often think about the one and the many in the same way as depicted by this phrase that I actually only came across relatively recently, but depicted by the phrase "e pluribus unum," and that was a maxim, that originally meant out of the many colonies, out of the many colonies, one nation. And eventually this phrase, it kind of grew and grew until it included cultural and European sort of national facets, out of many peoples, one people. Vedic customs, though, or Indic customs, they go further. They're using the same premise, if you like, to elaborate on religious inclusion, as it recognizes, as that religion recognizes, the great diversity of human understanding in relation to the Supreme Personality of Godhead, in relation to God, in relation to Krishna. All of that is touched on in the Vedas, I think in the Rig Veda in particular, and there's one verse that truth is one, though the wise refer to it by various names, which is kind of quite interesting. Whereas Western philosophers, they've also viewed the same statement, the e pluribus unum statement, they kind of interpreted it, if you like, in more abstract ways. To the point of harmony among variations or variants like that. Variants, we're talking about variants a lot these days, but harmony among variation, or harmony among different variants like that. Harmony among the one of the many like that. So the very basic or fundamental law, the very basic or fundamental law, it's all very interesting. But the understanding, the fundamental law of the universe, it said that the one of the many, that it's understood, is the law of the unity of the opposites, or the unity of the differences. And this came from basically the kind of philosophers of ancient Greek, etc. These kind of understandings came. But, it's fairly easy to see the connection between what was coming into European philosophy, if you like, see the connection with that of India. And again, it was reflected in both of those understandings, the theistic understanding as well as the atheistic understanding. But all of this is covered. That's the main point that I'm trying to get to in a roundabout way. That all of this is covered by Lord Chaitanya's presentation of the Achinta Veda Veda Tattva philosophy, the inconceivable oneness and difference between God and the living beings. Very basic, yet far-reaching philosophy, and at its core is explained basically that living beings are one with God, and yet they're also different from Him. In the same way, one example that Srila Prabhupada used to give, so they're the same but different. And the example that Prabhupada gave many different examples, but that a drop of water, if you chemically analyze a drop of water, it's exactly the same as the water in a vast reservoir, but simultaneously it's different from it. That's to say that a drop of water, may be one with a vast reservoir in terms of its quality, but it's different, as I've mentioned before, in terms of quantity. And likewise, in the same way, the living being are one and different from God. God, by definition, he has all auspicious qualities in full. Storehouse, if you like, of, strength, beauty, wealth, fame, knowledge, and renunciation. Now, we may also have those qualities, but we only have them in minute portions compared to, the Supreme Personality of Godhead. One obvious example is that we have a certain amount of strength, so we can, I just noticing this morning actually how heavy, particularly the first canto of Srimad-Bhagavatam is. So we may have some strength, we can lift up heavy things, but we couldn't lift up a mountain, wrong hand. We couldn't lift up a mountain just with our little finger like that. We don't have that level of strength. So the intrinsic essential qualities are the same, but to what degree we have them, and to what quantity we have them, to what degree we have them, that's different. So quality, not quantity. So devotee sages or Vaishnava sages, they've informed and still do inform that our oneness with God, it has certain limitations. It's not total like that. There are limitations to it. And while people like us, fledgling practitioners, we would do well to realize our oneness with all that exists, with God, etc. It's also incumbent upon us to understand what the differences are. And therefore we can sort of strive and reach for basically the pinnacle of spiritual pursuit. We can reach for that, going beyond, the sense of spiritual oneness, and placing ourselves in a loving relationship with the Supreme Personality of Godhead, who just happens to be the reservoir of all transcendental qualities and transcendental bliss like that, which again we deprive ourselves of if we only have this narrow, one-dimensional understanding of God as the Supreme Brahman like that. And the main person for promoting that impersonalistic theory was really Sankaracharya. But the story of Sankaracharya is so interesting because the understanding is that he was an incarnation of Lord Buddha. And Lord Buddha, of course, is an incarnation of Lord Krishna. When Lord Buddha incarnated or appeared approximately 2,500 years ago, there or thereabouts, so it's roughly halfway between Krishna's appearance and where we are today, Lord Buddha came. But at that time when he appeared, people were misusing the Vedas, misusing Vedic knowledge, to the extent of justifying meat eating, etc. And they were doing that on the basis of the Vedas, because there are, under sort of very limited circumstances, and for all different, the very limited circumstances, and even in those limited circumstances, very particular requirements that did allow for the sacrifice, if you like, of animals. But now they were using that just as an excuse to, basically eat meat every day of the week, and every different type of meat, etc. But because of their attachment to the Vedas and them having convinced themselves that this is justified by the Vedas, the only way that it could be broken, that Lord Buddha figured out that it could be broken, would be to break their connection with the Vedas. So he basically denounced the Vedas. But of course that got them to stop eating meat. So that was Lord Buddha's mission essentially. But it wasn't a long-term solution, for want of a better word, because the fact of the matter is that the Vedas are, the bona fide spiritual literature that we have. So then Sankaracharya came about 1,000 years after Lord Buddha to re-establish the Vedas. But his consideration was he could only do that in stages. To do it all in one go would be kind of basically too much for the people, and therefore he started with the step of impersonalism rather than going directly to the personalistic understanding. But at least it re-established some faith, a level of faith actually in the Vedas by doing that. And then later on, other personalities came, such as Lord Chaitanya, etc., to bring us right up, if you like, to the full understanding of our existence and our relationships, with the world, but our relationship more importantly with the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So that's what Lord Chaitanya came to do. So, and then the other interesting thing about Shankaracharya, of course, is that when he was leaving this world, he famously spoke or chanted Bhaja Govindam, Bhaja Govindam, Bhaja Govinda, basically saying that he's got it wrong, if you like, and the ultimate understanding and realization of the Supreme is not impersonal, but actually it's personal. And I worship Govinda, and Govinda, of course, means the protector of the cows and the giver of pleasure to the senses. So the senses, the senses have to engage, and they have to engage in a relationship like that. So anyway, it was just this understanding that Krishna, there is a Supreme Person like that. So this problem of duality in this world, and it starts from that basic duality or misunderstanding that somehow or other these bodies that we're carrying around with us, that that's who we are. So that's the basic misunderstanding. But then once you shed that misunderstanding, both shed it in terms of a philosophical understanding, but also in terms of how we live our lives, we then would live our lives in a way that we would understand that we're not this body, temporary body. But then once we've done that, then in terms of entering into relationships, there are different ways that we can have an impersonal relationship, the impersonal man, etc. And there are different ways of having relationships. So that's another duality that we can fall victim to, that thinking, it's all one, like that, when it's not. And that will just stunt the level of advancement we can make from a spiritual point of view. In fact, it's even more complicated than that, because it's not just that it would stunt it, but ultimately it's a really big negative to us, because you can't enter into that personal relationship. And then even when you get beyond that impersonal conception and accept and understand that Krishna's ultimate manifestation, if you like, is a personal one, as the Supreme Person. But then we can have different relationships with Krishna. It's not just all, the relationships are not all one. In fact, the relationships are all completely unique and completely different. But then, as we've spoken about before, there's 5 specific aspects of that relationship. Shantaras, which essentially means the relationship it's actually the first step up from impersonalism. It's more like being an observer, like doing window shopping, if you like. So Krishna's, on the inside, we're on the outside looking in, and we're not really engaging. It's more of an observing thing. We're not actually engaging in a direct relationship. But then we can have a Dasa relationship, a relationship as a servant, just being a servant of Krishna, a menial servant, if you like. Then we can have a relationship in friendship with Krishna, just being a buddy of Krishna, kind of nice concept. Then we can have a parental relationship with Krishna, where we play the role of being Krishna's parents. And then ultimately we can have a relationship with Krishna that's based on love, a loving relationship with Krishna. So there's all these different steps and stages and aspects, but as devotees, it's good for us to study and understand all these different kind of concepts, and understand all the intricacies of them, At the same time, we can accept them as is from our authorities, going right back to Krishna and down through the ages, all the different authorized representatives, of which Srila Prabhupada is the most recent, and he has given this extraordinary body of knowledge. And while Prabhupada himself was always of the view that he wanted his devotees to challenge him, actually, mainly training them up so that when they face challenges they would have the answers. So that's fine, to question and whatever. But then also, an even more direct route is just if we accept that Srila Prabhupada is a bona fide representative of Lord Krishna, then we can just dive in and immerse ourselves in all the wonderful teachings that Srila Prabhupada has given us, and just relish them as being quite extraordinary. And we will achieve perfection as a result of that. Both. It's again the Chintabheda Tattva, simultaneously oneness and difference. You can enter these, enter your relationship, if you like, with Srila Prabhupada's books from in different ways. You can enter in that mood of really, challenging. Of course, it's not that we challenge the philosophy as such, but we challenge ourselves, to actually free ourselves from doubt, to rid ourselves of any doubts that we might have. Arjuna prays to Krishna that way in the Bhagavad Gita. He refers to him as Madhusudana, which is the destroyer of doubts. So that's fine. Or we can, immerse ourselves in just relishing them, understanding that I think my own understanding of this is that, and certainly this is good when you're presenting to non-devotees, that it's not that we blindly follow, and actually we don't blindly follow anyway, but some people may perceive it like that, but it's not that we blindly follow, it's just that, we can read and study so many different philosophical understandings, philosophical traditions, etc., religious, spiritual traditions. You can study so many of them, and of course, while I wouldn't say that I've studied all of them, or that I've completely studied even any of them, to the degree that I do understand different religious traditions and have read about them and understood them, it's just a simple fact. It's just a simple logical fact for me, at least. And I'm sure it's the same for everybody else who has read Srila Prabhupada's books. It's just such a simple thing that, wow, these contain, both in a broad sense, in a quantitative sense, so much more information than anything else I've read in the realm of spirituality or philosophy. But also the depth of them, what they're presenting. It's not just how much is being presented, it's what's being presented. It's so deep and light years beyond anything else that I've ever read or come across in other spiritual traditions or philosophical presentations like that. So it's this kind of dual thing. It's not just got quantity, it's got quality and depth. And my simple view is that maybe there's something even superior than that out there. Maybe there is something superior, but I haven't come across it yet. And if I ever do come across it, something that has even more quantity, even more quality and depth, then I can, I can become, I can become a fan of that and a follower of all of that. But as it stands right now, I've never come across that. It doesn't exist, and therefore it makes perfect sense for immersion and absorption in what we have now in front of us. But as I say, if something better comes along, I'm convinced that won't happen. But if it does, then we can review things at that point. But right now, why not immerse ourselves in and absorb ourselves in all of this knowledge that Srila Prabhupada has provided us with? Because right now, there is nothing else out there that even comes close to the quantity and the quality of Śrimad-Bhagavatam and Bhagavad Gita. And here, just to finish on this note, that Arjuna is now benefiting from all of that. and because of his direct association with Krishna, his direct association with following his tradition and following this philosophy, that even now, when Krishna has in a physical form, for want of a better word, Krishna has left. So Arjuna's feeling kind of bereft. But the principle of Vani and Vapu, that Krishna was there in his Vapu form, and Arjuna could directly see and engage with Krishna in his personal form. That personal form is gone, but Krishna's instructions, Vani, they remain. So therefore Arjuna is now, to transcend whatever bereftness he's feeling, he is taking shelter of his Vani association, the instructions that he's received from Krishna. And that's putting him perfectly on the spiritual platform, above the three modes of nature, free from any duality and free from any contamination of this material world. Okay, thank you all very much, and I hope you all have a good day. And if for some reason you're not having a good day, that maybe you'll get a chance to pick up one of Prabhupada's books and read a few sentences or a few paragraphs or even a chapter or two. And I'm sure that will make your day a lot better. Thank you all very much. Hare Krishna. Srila